So again, good afternoon. I'm really pleased to be here today. I'm pleased to be talking about this initiative. I think that's going to help drive lower methane emissions from the natural gas life cycle. The title, which we've already talked about, is MiQ, a global market-driven system to grade natural gas by methane emissions. I think this title more or less encapsulates everything that I'm here to talk about, but in the coming hour, I'm going to walk you through our motivation for this initiative and how it works. Again, I'd introduce myself. I'm a part of the Climate Intelligence for Oil and Gas team at RMI, and my primary work is focusing on the MiQ initiative, and I'm based in Boulder, Colorado. So, a little bit about MiQ. We are an independent, not-for-profit partnership between RMI and SYSTEMIQ. Our aim is to rapidly reduce methane emissions in the oil and gas sector through certified and differentiated natural gas. Our team currently spans the Atlantic with a strong base in both North America, to all you Canadians, yes, we're paying attention, and in Europe. So our team is comprised of natural gas market experts, traders, environmental scientists, a lot of policy experts, and a few of us scientists or tradespeople. And I wanted to take the opportunity to mention that we're currently building out our team, and this is actually true across much of RMI, and we are hiring for full-time positions for analysts and senior analysts. And we're also interested in graduate students and contract hires because this is a really growing initiative. So I encourage you, if you're interested or you know anybody who's interested, visit us at rmi.org and check out the career page, or just shoot me an email directly. I'm happy to have a conversation about it. So this is just a little bit of a nod to some of my partners, but there's a lot of other additional people that are also working behind the scenes. So what drives the MiQ initiative? Oops, hope that didn't do too much. Essentially, as each of you are aware, we want to find rapidly adoptable mechanisms to drive methane emission reduction. Global methane emissions have risen steadily and nearly 10% in the past 2 decades, and they'll just continue to rise unless abatement steps are taken. And we at MiQ feel that tackling unwanted methane emissions from the oil and gas industry is a really smart place to start, and particularly from the natural gas value chain. Natural gas, while often presented as a clean transition fuel because it burns more cleanly than other fossil fuels, this label often ignores that methane leakage that's released to the atmosphere, as you guys are all aware. And whenever this gas is extracted or moved through pipelines or distributed into homes and businesses, this is a real risk. And many would argue, and in fact, a lot believe that most, if not all, natural gas currently used in buildings or, say, residential use or electrical power generation can and must be replaced in the near term with clean energy and clean electricity. However, the realistic timeline for this is uncertain. So phasing natural gas out, particularly in the industrial sector, it's not going to be a very fast timeline, and there's no readily available alternative for gas in a lot of industrial processes. So we accept this, and we accept that methane emissions associated with this transition are not insignificant. And of the 84 million metric tons that are generated each year of the global emissions from oil and gas, more than half of those are derived from natural gas. So what can we do today ahead of these major institutional changes to reduce emissions? Now, for MiQ, we propose a market-based solution for mitigating methane emissions from natural gas during this energy transition. Now, why a market-based solution? Because there's so many opportunities for near-term abatement, which helps address the near-term climate-forcing impact of methane. And these opportunities are available at minor or fully recoverable costs, meaning the cost can be offset from the natural gas that's lost to the atmosphere. And in this slide, I'm showing a very familiar marginal abatement cost curve. You guys have all seen this, which addresses the currently recognized sources and solutions for emissions avoidance. I mean, such as incentives for better monitoring practices, rapid repair of leakages, more efficient flaring, repairing vintage equipment, valves, pneumatics, controllers, all these things that emit by design. And it's understood that this graph is from 2019. There's been some updates that are probably more reflective of the current natural gas prices. but the message and the opportunities remain the same. A lot of really low-cost solutions that can be implemented today. And at MiQ, we're interested, as I mentioned earlier, the entire natural gas supply chain. We recognize that's important. However, by focusing on production, we are tackling the largest sources of emissions first. And in the current scope of MiQ, we're working on the standard for onshore and offshore production, which is shown here, with an ambition to move into the bigger chunks of the pie, including midstream. And this is actually being scoped out for within the next year because we've made so much progress on the upstream side already. So how do we incentivize paying for these small operational changes that could potentially have big impact in avoiding emissions? Many of these actions are currently voluntary, but we're witnessing a demand for low emissions natural gas by consumers and investors. Some examples that I point to are, Tokyo Gas and GS Gas from Korea have received their first net zero LNG cargo in 2019. Now, this has helped launch Tokyo Gas's hydrogen refueling station that processes hydrogen using net zero LNG. France's Engie, for example, has also, one of Europe's largest energy companies, rejected a commitment, quite famously rejected a commitment to a long-term LNG import contract with NextDecade. This was driven in large part by concerns over greenhouse gas emissions of the US gas production side. And gas distributors, a good example is Duke Energy, are making bold claims to investors and consumers about reducing methane emissions in their natural gas business and are aiming for things like net zero by 2030, with a lot of others by at least 2050. So why not develop a market for differentiated, low emissions natural gas to support this demand? So the question is, how do we implement this differentiation? Well, on one hand, we have voluntary company practices. These are currently in place with, enabling forward-looking companies already to signal efforts that are above and beyond regulatory compliance, and we applaud that. However, these, currently lack accountability and visibility, and will be slow to adopt on a really, really broad scale. On the other hand, we have regulation and policy. This does generate a mandate and enforces mechanisms for better practices. However, regulation is currently limited by jurisdiction. And something that we've noticed is when jurisdictions regulate inconsistently across the board, it creates actually a disincentive for best practices. The third way we believe is certification. Now, MiQ aims to enable a voluntary market, which can have, we believe, big impact, especially where regulation is insufficient. And certification also empowers leading producers to be credibly recognized for going above and beyond. Certification enables a level playing field and creates tradable certificates, which can be used on the open market. And most importantly, certification should be, and is in this case, transparent, independent, and audible. In my opinion, the visibility of emissions goes beyond what's currently reported and will enable that visibility. It offers credibility in certified products. And we think if you can track these improvements as to what, say, passes for good low emissions gas over time, as the demand and the practices improve, these certifications will have a multiplier effect. Now, our market-based approach creates this push and pull to drive industry change. Consumer demand and premium pricing, or possibly discount pricing, pulls on the one hand for low emissions. Meanwhile, in an open and transparent market, the standard generates pressure from peer groups who are looking at each other, seeing how each other are doing. It creates that visibility that investors can look at, as well as regulators. And these all push the natural gas suppliers to up their game if they're not already. And with MiQ, we really believe that market differentiation of natural gas as a commodity will spur emissions reductions, and demand will create those different price levels. And these different price levels will serve as the direct incentives for emissions abatement. And we can point to lots of good examples of market disruption towards cleaner fuels and cleaner energy production. And we've seen market-driven differentiation take hold, for example, in renewable energy markets. RECs and similar mechanisms have occurred in other regions. And in transportation fuels, like California's low carbon fuel standard and the EU's ultra-low sulfur diesel standard. Just for example. So what makes a low emissions natural gas? I mean, what is it the MiQ certification looks for? What do we want in order to differentiate low emissions natural gas from the rest of the pack? Our certification system is based on 3 key elements that we've determined will have the largest impact overall, rather than focusing on any one in particular. First off, we're starting with a baseline calculated methane intensity, nothing fancy. In this case, we're trying to align with a lot of readily acceptable methods. In this case, calculation methods outlined in NGSI protocol. And on top of that, we layer requirements for deployment of monitoring technology, focusing on both source level and facility level emissions. And lastly, we impose best company practices that look at equipment used, well lifting methods, record keeping, company culture around training and incentivizing detecting and repairing leaks. And at the end of the day, by implementing these monitoring and company practices, those methane emissions will go down, as well as the methane intensity. Now, this strategy lends towards a holistic and inclusive grading system. Now, I show the grade distribution on the bottom of the slide. This is what we're aiming for on the production end for MiQ. For example, an A-grade gas must have 1, exemplary and low emission methane intensities, 2, demonstrated monitoring of both the source and facility level, in this case at a quarterly basis or some sort of continuous monitoring covering a majority of the well pads, as well as 3, meeting each of the requirements for best company policies and procedures for managing methane. And it's important to note that for a facility to be even eligible for certification under MiQ, its monitoring practices and company practices must meet some minimum requirements. We don't just let anything be certified. And based on a scoring system, so basically points that you get for better management, you achieve higher grades that can be obtained possibly with more ambitious technology or more ambitious practices. And we also try and reward demonstration of improvement over time in these areas. So for monitoring technology, MiQ is quite specifically non-prescriptive when it comes to brands or methods, only to the frequency of detection and minimal detection limits or capabilities. The goal is to monitor entire facilities where possible, as well as the source level, in order to catch these major emission sources and avoid cherry picking of only those better performing well pads or well pads with newer equipment. And as you can see from this super simplified diagram, I'm sure I'm going to get some flack for this, a number of monitoring options lend themselves to this type of both broad and localized coverage. And MiQ intends to continue to upgrade its requirements for monitoring practices in the standard through time. I mean, as technology evolves, as detection limits and world's access to these technologies improve through time. Now, the accreditation system that we have developed at MiQ is also important for maintaining credibility, transparency, and accountability, like I mentioned earlier. MiQ, as I demonstrated in this figure, is the standard holder. And in that role, we oversee the governance of the accreditation system, and we're responsible for drafting, writing, and updating the standard through time, making sure that it's still applicable and credible. Now, then there is a third-party certificate issuing body who is responsible for issuing certificates and transferring of information on certificate usage and retirement into the registry. And then we have independent auditors, and these must be technical experts, not just financial auditors, as well as being accredited in their capacity. And they will conduct reviews at the natural gas production facilities to understand those emissions calculations and help improve transparency and credibility there. They'll review monitoring practices and company practices. And once independent audits are complete, a grade for the facility for the upcoming year, that full year, is submitted to the certification body. Now, upon proof of metered gas into the system at a certified facility, certificates are generated, which can then be used, say, in a bilateral contract or even applied to the spot market. Now, something to point out about the structure is that MiQ remains a neutral outside entity throughout this process and is uninvolved in the certification of any particular facility or involved in any particular deal. Now, when designing our market system, MiQ recognized the need to balance the credibility of buying and selling of low emissions natural gas in a local and traceable way, while still allowing for the demand to kind of propagate beyond one single part of the country or one finite region. So in order for certificates to be bought and sold, a physical grid connection between the buyer and the seller must be demonstrated. And really that's it. This is kind of plays a similar role as the electrical grid for renewable energy credits. So it doesn't require actual electrons to be tracked, but that grid enables connection and traceability between suppliers and users. And in the same way, the natural gas grid and hubs allow for methane emission performance to be claimed without actual molecule tracking. And MiQ certificates are currently generated for natural gas production only. But as you can see in this figure, we'll eventually move into midstream and transport sectors to allow additional certificate generation as emissions are avoided. And gas consumers will purchase these certificates, thereby displacing conventional gas and upstream methane emissions. And once that volume of certified gas is consumed, their certificate is retired and tracked in the registry. Now, while MiQ Standard does not focus on quantification of methane emissions, which are targeted for carbon offsets, for example, we do believe that tracking impact means talking in terms that make sense for consumers and terms such as CO2 equivalents. For example, the annual consumption of natural gas for a family, a large family home, might equal the consumption of 17 MiQ certificates. And for reference, one certificate is equal to 1 megawatt hour thermal. And the simple choice in this example of upgrading from a D, which might be an average grade of gas out there on the market right now, to a B grade, would result in the same emissions avoidance as, say, a one-way cross-country flight. Now, I don't know if that sounds like a whole lot, but when we scale this across entire communities or industrial centers or industrial usage, we're talking about a lot of natural gas and a lot of greenhouse gas emissions avoided. Now, a common question that we get, and it's a good one, is what does the certification process cost? For certification logistics alone, the intent is for the cost to be very minimal. Now, MiQ is a nonprofit with no commercial interest in the usage of the certification. Costs include the use of an auditor, maybe a small fee for the registration and certificate generation, basically to keep the registry up and running. On the operational side, we see a lot of producers already in good standing as is. So for them, it would be minimal cost for upgrade or monitoring deployment to meet these standard gradings. An additional cost would just be personnel time or meeting with auditors for any particular facility. And we expect the cost for meeting the standard to be only slightly more than conventional natural gas production overall. And very importantly, considerably less than simply using conventional natural gas and then needing to purchase offsets to get those same emissions avoidances. So if you're trying to achieve net zero, if you're trying to achieve your ESG goals, this is a much more cost-effective way of doing it. And once investments in new monitoring technologies, equipment, and practices are in place, this should be fully recoverable in additional years once that facility is certified. So we would like to think, what is MiQ's aim? In terms of impact, just want to hit home on sort of our initial motivation. The first is the big one. Can we start making changes today? With deployment of a standard and a mechanism such as certification to meet growing demand, we can start emissions avoidance immediately. And that's really the goal, because methane is important today. And we start today, but we learn and we improve through time. MiQ is technology agnostic, like I mentioned before. We would love to see the proliferation of better and more precise monitoring tools and sensors, and allow opportunities for technical experts to work with producers and to be useful and profitable in this space. So better technology will only benefit from this. Furthermore, we require independent auditors and certifiers so as to avoid any conflict of interest and maintain a level playing field. And lastly, because MiQ is independent, because our standard is written for a global audience, because our standard is already aligned with voluntary initiatives such as OGMP 2.0, and we are focused on transparency and currently embrace a lot of legislation that already exists, we really believe and know that we're well positioned to be adopted on a global scale. And this is going to be really, really important for being the standard, or a widely adoptable standard. So where are we today? MiQ has developed this draft standard for both onshore and offshore production, like I mentioned earlier. We've engaged already directly with producers, emissions experts, traders, and are incorporating some of their feedback into our standard. We are finalizing the construction of a governance body and systems to allow the standard to be fully operational. So really excited that to happen in the next couple months. And we're facilitating pilots between producers and consumers right now to road test that onshore and offshore standard. And simultaneously, we're working on the next phase components in the natural gas value chain, including midstream and LNG. So please stay tuned, and I'm happy to update you when that all happens. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.